YouTubers, and welcome back to the Holtzmichel channel and another episode of Hot Shop Tips. Today we're going to be taking another look at this shaper, and the subject for today is how to set up your spindle correctly. Now this is a spindle shaper. We saw it in the last episode where we put the fence on, and the one thing that I noticed is that the guy that keeps using this machine is always installing his cutters incorrectly. Now, there are a few things that you need to watch out for when you're using this kind of machine, and of course this applies also to routers where you have a spindle arbor in your router table, for example, and you're putting distance rings or spacer rings. You have spacer rings here on the shaft that help lock down the cutter on the spindle. And now the question is, how much thread do you need to leave sticking out? And you want a full engagement on the nut on the spindle, but if you've noticed, if you turn the nut all the way down, you're only going to have like maybe 2.5 millimeters of thread on the spindle shaft sticking up out of the nut, and that has a reason. So they don't want you to have too much thread sticking out, so that if there's ever some piece of hard material that goes sailing off, or a knife breaks, that you're going to have problems getting the nut off the spindle. So you don't want too much thread sticking out, but then again, you don't want any of the nut or the spindle being recessed into the nut. In other words, let's take a look at a nut that is incorrectly installed right here. Now, like I said, you want to have some of the threads on the spindle shaft sticking up out of the nut. And so here's a correctly installed nut. Now, as you notice, there's a little bit of thread, maybe one course of thread sticking up out, and that's all you really need. You want a full engagement, because if you don't have full engagement of the thread, there could be other problems that arise. One is you need to look at, if there's too much thread sticking up out of on the spindle, chances are you're not going to have enough pressure on your spacer rings to hold your cutter in place. Now, inversely, if you have too much sticking out, you run the risk of stripping the threads. And like I said, this applies to routers with spindle arbors for various jobs that you have in the shop on your router table as well. So always keep in mind, you want to have a certain engagement of, there's some kind of a pneumatic discharge back there that just startled the snot out of me. So, but anyway, you want to have a certain, you got to have a certain purchase on the threads in order to maintain a safe working environment for the spindle or the tool. Now, the other thing is too, and this is particularly true of routers, if you engage your workpiece a little too sudden, you can stall the bit. And if that happens, then you can spin it on the shaft, and if that, again, or the thread will strip out, and then you got the whole works flying around your ears, and then you got a real problem. So again, maximum engagement on a thread, and to maintain that certain safety margin that you need for this type of machine. These things are, can be a really safe machine to work with, but as soon as the setup is somewhat off, they can be extremely dangerous as well. So always keep that in mind when you're working on one of these things like this. So here we're going to show you the correct setup on a spindle. We'll go through the anatomy of it first real quick. Always be aware that your nut up here will open in the direction of rotation. So if you have, this is the, this would just be the left-hand side spindle. So this is going to have a left-hand thread. The other spindle has a right-hand thread. And as the spindle turns, the nut will tighten up through the inertia. If I were to hold this and spin the spindle, now always be aware that your spindle is going to cut opposite the direction of the workflow. So the wood comes through the machine this way. Your spindle, this spindle is going to turn clockwise. And the other spindle is going to turn counterclockwise. So as you can see, there you go. There's your nut tightened up. So we'll take the nut off. And of course you got your threads up here. There's another, this is a different kind of setup that you saw like on the shaper spindle. Some shaper spindles have this hex nut on top. You'll see the tool here shortly that we're going to use on this. And so you got a shoulder down here, and we're going to go ahead and put a thin spacer ring on the bottom. Now this isn't really necessary. You can or can't, you don't have to do this. I recommend it because if your cutter spins on the shaft, then you won't have the shoulder all boogered up. Now, if a cutter spins on the shaft, you'll not only have the shoulder boogered up, or the shaft boogered, but galled, but you'll have the shoulder as well. And if your shoulder is galled, then your cutter won't quite go on square because all your pressure is coming from above and it's pushing up against this shoulder. Now this spindle has a slight bend to it, so it wobbles, and eventually the spindle will fail. And the reason being for it is with the cycles of tightening and loosening on the thread here, this thing is forced to straighten out. So the side that it leans to is eventually going to weaken and crack and then break. And so the spindle should by all rights be replaced. I don't know how much it has, but when I was cleaning this up on the lathe, it was quite bad. So let's go ahead, we'll put on our first little spacer ring, and then our cutter. So we're below the table, which is good. And now we're going to put on our spacer rings here. Now, you want to get, like I mentioned, enough thread showing to where you can get your nut flush. And so the thing I'm trying to, well, I guess what I'm trying to say here is, if you have these thinner rings, which you'll have invariably, put those on first, and then you see how much you got left. So let me go grab some more rings here. And if they don't want to go on, just stick your bigger one on there, and then they just slip right on. So this one here, yeah, this one will have to go on. And here's the other thing. You have a larger diameter ring here, so put him on first right up against the cutter, and then the rest right up on top of that. And there you go, Bob's your uncle. So we still need about a ½ inch here. Let me go see if I can find one. Now this is too much. So now we have a little bit too much, so what we're going to do is take out a thin one here. So let's see. Okay, we still got a little too much. Take out another thin one. So we got a little bit of thread showing up here. We can go ahead and either put on a thin ring. Let me see if I got a thin spacer here. I do. And so now we'll be perfectly flush. So let's go ahead and spin this guy on. And see here we've got full purchase on the threads. We have We can have up to about a course of threads sticking out, which is good. I'll have to go ahead and take it up flush. So let's go ahead and tighten this up. And so here's our special tool. This engages the nut on top. Nah. Helps to have it the right way. There we go. And oingo boingo, Bob's your uncle. There you go. Well, YouTubers, that's a wrap for today's little episode of Hot Shop Tips. I'm hoping you were able to take away a small lesson from this and found some of the information here quite useful. If you have any thoughts, comments, critiques, suggestions, by all means put them in the comments section below. Keep in mind that every little bit of traffic in that regards helps in the ratings for the videos to move up. So anyway, with that, thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you all again soon.